Lindy's Spirit, Charles Lindbergh's historical transatlantic flight. "It's a pity," one of the shivering French bystanders whispered into the darkness, "because he was such a brave boy." Another onlooker agreed with her dismal prognosis and proclaimed, "He can't do it without navigation instruments." As 10 p.m. ticked by, the hopes of many of the thousands of bystanders were overshadowed by foreboding clouds of doubt. After all, prior to young Charles Lindbergh's attempt, several other pilots had tried to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a non-stop solo flight. Sadly, their attempts had ended in either failure or tragedy. The ruminations about Lindbergh's probable demise switched off when the airfield lights suddenly switched on. Accompanied by the roar of an airplane engine, the glaring floodlights illuminated a solitary airplane, slicing through the darkness. Following a momentary hush, cheers ricocheted across the field. The previous clouds of doubt dissipated, replaced with a billowing optimism. Then, just as a swell of relief swept across the crowd, the lights flashed off. The plane, they were sadly informed, was not Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. Their previous gloom returned with increased intensity. Despite their deep disappointment, the onlookers continued to scrutinize the cold, windy night canopy. Desperately, they searched for the tiny gray and white plane that was pictured in their morning newspapers. Finally, at 10:16 p.m., both their doubts and disappointment vanished. After a gripping 33-and-a-half-hour flight, the young aviator set his Spirit of St. Louis down on the runway across from the crowd. One observer recalled it seemed to stop almost as it hit the ground, so gently did it land. As with the previous false alarm, a moment of silent vigilance initially settled over the viewers, but this time the lights didn't turn off. One by one, the observers realized they had just witnessed history. Amidst screams of victory, thousands surged forward past the soldiers and police stationed to keep them back. Soon the guards, too, abandoned their hopeless task and joined the mad rush toward the plane. Responding to a cry from the oncoming masses of "Cette fois ça va," French for "this time it's done," an exhausted, frazzled-haired Lindbergh grinned and said simply, "Well, I made it." Not sharing his calm demeanor, the bystanders were swept into a frenzy and tossed him on their shoulders to celebrate the record-breaking moment. Two French aviators noted the onrushing mass of humanity and quickly hustled him into a car to drive to the safety of the airport commandant's office. As they sped across the field, fervent souvenir hunters actually began cutting strips of linen from the Spirit's wings. Fortunately, a squad of soldiers soon guarded the plane as mechanics rolled it into a shed. At about midnight, Lindbergh was furtively driven from the field for a well-earned rest. That rest was especially necessary since he had not slept the night before the flight. Lindbergh's nerves had kept sleep at bay, assisted by several newspaper reporters who staged an all-night noisy poker game in an adjacent hotel room. Despite his lack of sleep, as the morning of May the 20th, 1927 dawned, the stage was set for a history-making success, or a legendary tragedy. The momentous flight was spurred by $25,000 offered by a French hotel magnate, Raymond Ortigue, for the first non-stop flight from either New York to Paris or the reverse. Never one to turn down a challenge, Detroit-born Charles Lindbergh had eagerly signed up for the contest. For the previous year, he had been flying an airmail route from St. Louis to Chicago. Prior to that, he spent years touring the country as a barnstorming stunt flyer, using a surplus Curtiss Jenny biplane. In addition to learning flying skills, Lindbergh had become a bit of a wheeler-dealer, and managed to drum up the funding for the New York to Paris project from 9 St. Louis businessmen. Once he'd obtained the money, Lindbergh ordered a custom-built plane from Ryan Aeronautical Company of San Diego. He'd always loved tinkering with machinery and helped the engineers design his new home in the sky. After intricately calculating the requirements for the 3,600-mile passage, they modified a basic Ryan NYP high-wing monoplane with an increased wingspan and larger than normal gas tank, placed in front of the cockpit. Although sitting behind a huge gas tank doesn't seem particularly rational, they felt the tank would be less likely to explode in a crash rather than positioned lower in the fuselage. Since the 450-gallon tank blocked forward vision, they installed a periscope. In order to lighten the overall plane load, they designed a lightweight wicket seat and left off everything they decided wasn't absolutely necessary. This excess equipment included not only a gas gauge, radio, and night flying lights, but even navigation equipment and a parachute. Clearly, Lindbergh was planning a make-it-or-break-it flight. The flight commenced at 7:52 a.m., May the 20th, 1927, as the Spirit nosed into the clear sky over Long Island's Roosevelt Field. Due to the heavy fuel load, it barely cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway. Once aloft, Lindbergh headed northeast up the coast to Newfoundland. Finally, he left the comfort of land behind to begin his excursion across the Atlantic. As darkness fell, the droning of the engine and the sameness of the ocean surface nearly lulled him into a trance. His previous lack of sleep began to catch up with him as his eyelids transformed into cumbersome weights. Knowing if he closed his eyes he would crash, he made the gutsy decision to fly close to the ocean surface. His strategy worked. The ocean spray helped keep him alert, as did the ever-present knowledge that if he lost his concentration, death awaited him just 10 feet below. Soon his initial overwhelming tiredness transformed into a numbing fatigue that included hallucinations of, as he later described them, transparent forms that moved freely about. I saw them plain as day, Lindbergh would later reveal, saying the spirits, as he named them, spoke in friendly voices and even reassured him of his safety. Eventually those spirits in the spirit took their leave as Lindbergh seemed to catch his second wind. Soon a blinding fog likely made him question his wisdom of leaving behind the navigational equipment. For several hours he intermittently lost sight of the stars he was using to plot his route. Fortunately, the brief glimpses of stars were sufficient. After 24 hours in the air, he spotted several fishing boats. By about 3 o'clock p.m. local time, he recognized the coast of Ireland. Not only was he only 3 miles off course, but was actually 2 hours ahead of schedule. The changes in terrain as he continued not only boosted his morale, but helped subdue the mind-numbing effects of the endless seascape. By about 8 o'clock p.m., as night was falling, he reached France's border and headed toward Paris. His landing there was actually delayed a few minutes, since the Le Bourget airport was not on his map. He knew it was about 7 miles northeast of the city, but was confused when he first saw it. Observing bright lights spread out in all directions, he initially took it for a huge industrial complex. The dazzling lights actually resulted from rows of headlights of thousands of French motorists driving in to see him land. When he realized the source, he happily pointed the spirit of St. Louis toward the airport and the legend of lucky Lindy toward immortality.